Consciousness is the field where everything happens. Whatever happens outside the field of consciousness, yours, mine, and everybody else's, outside all fields of consciousness, might as well not exist.
Welcome, friends, to a podcast with interesting people. I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is the Adrian Sinclair Show. My guest today, Bernardo Kastrup, is a book author. A fascinating topic that we're going to cover today, which is going to be metaphysics, consciousness, and merging of those in science. And just to kind of give you a quick little bio over here to go through the byline of what Bernardo has produced so far. He wrote, this is his 8th book, which is Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics, and that's what we're going to be talking about. But he also wrote 7 other books: Rationalist Spirituality, an exploration of the meaning of life and existence informed by logic and science; Dreamed Up Reality, Meaning and Absurdity, The Idea of the World, a multidisciplinary argument for the mental nature of reality. Those are just few of the books that he wrote. A little bit of a background on him, and we're going to let him speak and tell us a little bit more about himself. But he has a Ph.D. in philosophy of mind, and a Ph.D. in computer engineering, specifically reconfigurable computing and artificial intelligence. He's a scientist who worked at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the CERN, C-E-R-N, and the Philips Research Laboratories, where the Casimir effect of quantum field theory was discovered. He formulated in detail in many academic papers and books. His ideas have been featured on Scientific American, the Institute of Art and Ideas, the blog of the American Philosophical Association, and Big Think. Welcome to the show, Bernardo. Really happy to have you here. You are sort of like a rainbow unicorn in a way, because you are merging these very disparate fields, I guess, which are kind of coming together. So you have science on one end, and then philosophy on the other hand, talking about these less than scientifically provable things, and yet they are merging right now. And that's why I'm so excited about talking to you, to kind of glean what is happening right now in the field of research that's supporting a lot of the things that you've been working on.
Fantastic. I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to it. So the book that you're doing right now, Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics, how do you what was the beginning of the journey? I mean, you wrote 7 books. This is your 8th book, so you wrote 8 books. And you're merging these two worlds of, science and philosophy. What made you, jump into Schopenhauer's stuff? Because he's primarily known as a philosopher. And I'm just curious, how did you, get into exploring that avenue? Well, nature is only one thing, right? We divide it up into science and philosophy for our methodological convenience. Science studies the behavior of nature, philosophy studies what nature is in and of itself. But this is our own convenient separation. What is out there is nature. It is what it is. It behaves the way it behaves. I started my journey in science. I have a scientific background. I did computer engineering, but I ended up working at CERN as the very first job in my life, 2 days after I defended my thesis project. Mm-hmm. So I have all that, that science methodology, value system inculcated in me since very early. I went to university. I had just turned 17. But I never stopped thinking about nature, also from a philosophical perspective, because I was interested not only in how nature behaved, I was always very interested in what nature essentially is in and of itself. And that leads you down philosophical avenues of investigation, particularly when you're doing AI, for instance, artificial intelligence. A lot of people conflate that with artificial consciousness. Officially, they are not the same thing, but it's a very natural bridge to make. And once you go down that path, you start thinking about the nature of mind and the nature of reality. That's what I did. Yeah, there's some hard questions that we're going to ask on this show because, mentioning consciousness and science right now, science is trying to kind of pick things apart, right? Dissect things into smaller components and see what things are made out of. Consciousness is sort of like elusive in that respect, right? It's very difficult to kind of pinpoint what it really is. What is it to you? How do you define it through all your research that you've done? You've kind of tackled a lot of different perspectives. So if you would congeal a sort of opinion of what consciousness is to you, what would that be?
Consciousness is the field where everything happens. Whatever happens outside the field of consciousness, yours, mine, and everybody else's, outside all fields of consciousness, might as well not exist because it's never experienced, it's never registered. We tend to conceptualize consciousness as something derivative, as something that arises out of something else, like matter, for instance. But this is just one possible avenue of conceptualization. I see consciousness as nature's ultimate primitive. It's the one thing you cannot explain in terms of anything else because it's fundamental. It's a given. It's the field where everything else happens. You can explain everything else in terms of consciousness, but not consciousness in terms of anything else. So if I were to define it, I would just say consciousness is that whose excitations constitute all reality.
So one of the things when we think about consciousness is so in a way when you say the ultimate primitive, like as in like an axiom, like the baseline sort of component that cannot be taken apart, even further?
Yes, because if you think about it, what is an explanation? Explanation is a reduction. If I explain A in terms of B, then I'm reducing A to B. I'm saying that A is just an effect of the arrangement or dynamics of B. So all that really exists is B. A is derivative. So every explanation is a reduction of this form. But of course, you can't keep on explaining one thing in terms of another forever. At some point, otherwise you get into a loop, which means that you don't explain anything. At some point, you hit rock bottom, and you have to say, this element I cannot explain. It's a given of nature. It's what nature is in and of itself.
Right.
And that's a valid thing to do so long as you explain everything else in terms of that fundamental thing that you've identified. Then you're playing the game correctly.
So let me play a little bit of a devil's advocate over here, because when we think of consciousness, especially in the animal kingdom, we look at man, we look at humans, and then we look at animals, and what is consciousness? Is a dog conscious? Is a cat conscious? We think that's so, right? And then we kind of go down is bacteria conscious? You go down the kind of the chain, and then up in the opposite direction, looking at humans, looking at people who are have brain injuries and things like that. At some point, what happens when you switch off that consciousness? At what point you have that conscious, unconscious, right? And there's a lot of research kind of done trying to figure that out. Is it a function of the brain, like this organ that you have in your skull? If you take it apart, at some point, does it stop being conscious because you take it apart, or is it still conscious, but we just can't register at that level, that consciousness? What do you think about that?
Yeah, these are all the right things to ask, especially given the ethos of our culture. That's what what comes to mind immediately when somebody dares to say consciousness is all there is. How come? Because people die or they go unconscious at night when they fall asleep. When I say that consciousness is the fundamental aspect of reality, the one primitive, the thing you can reduce everything else to, I don't mean that it's your personal consciousness or my personal consciousness or my cat's individual consciousness. I'm talking about consciousness as a category, as it's not a substance, it's the subject, not an object, but as a kind, as a type of existent. And from that perspective, your personal consciousness, my personal consciousness, is a particular localization, a particular dissociation or configuration of this broader consciousness that I'm talking about. Now, if everything is reducible to consciousness, then of course consciousness cannot cease to exist. But mine and your personal consciousness can stop insofar as we are particular localizations of this broader field of consciousness. Those localizations can end. Consciousness itself doesn't. As for the things we know affect our conscious inner life, like alcohol, some material substance, right? You drink it and your inner life changes. Or if somebody shoots you in the head, something is going to happen to your inner life. Or a surgeon takes a scalpel to your brain and starts poking around, something will happen to your consciousness. But notice that the claim here is not a dualist one. I'm not saying that there is matter and there is consciousness, and consciousness is fundamental next to matter. What I'm saying is that there is only consciousness. What we call matter, including my brain, or in your brain, in my view, is just how particular mental processes present themselves across a dissociative boundary, across a mental boundary of some sort. It's just the way mental processes look like. And by that same token, the surgeon's scalpel, the alcohol, everything that can influence your inner life through, quote, physical means, are also what other conscious processes, what other mental processes look like that you don't identify yourself with. And of course, mental processes, when they interact, they affect one another. That's why when the surgeon's scalpel interacts with your brain, those are both images of mental processes in the process of interaction, like the scalpel cutting into your brain. And of course, there will be a conscious effect of that because you have mental processes interacting. It will give you another example. Your thoughts interact with your emotions. They are completely different. They feel completely different. A thought is rather abstract, doesn't have emotional charge. Right. An emotion is more instinctive, more intuitive, has a lot of affective charge, but they can modulate one another. They can influence one another. A bad thought can lead to very bad feelings, and bad feelings can lead to pessimistic thoughts. So my claim is that something of that sort, not exactly the same, of course, but something of that sort is what happens when alcohol interferes with your inner life, when a surgeon's scalpel cuts into your brain. Those are images of mental processes that affect one another, just like thoughts affect emotions and the other way around.
Very interesting. So are we part of oneness in that respect? If this is sort of like the common denominator of all that there is in terms of existence, irreducible element, consciousness in which everything else kind of manifests, does that imply that we're sort of like a manifestation of one consciousness?
That is certainly the most economical, parsimonious attitude to take, or assumption to make, because otherwise, you see, if consciousness is a primitive, it cannot be reduced to anything else. If you say that it's not one, that there are many, then you have the burden to explain why there are many fundamental conscious primitives in nature. Why would they all arise at the same time and be able to interact with one another? I mean, that seems to be very forced. It sort of defies the reductionist mentality of science, which has proven correct over the past 4 centuries, mostly correct over the past 4 centuries. So I am of the view, based both on a considerations of parsimony, what's the simplest, most parsimonious, most economic explanation, and also based on certain empirical evidence we have that, in fact, there is only one universal consciousness, and we are dissociated mental processes of it that arise within it and eventually dissolve within it as well.
So this is kind of like we're getting onto the sort of a spiritual path over here, where a lot of people, and this is why it's so, I would say, in a way, appealing to a lot of people, where they think of themselves as sort of like emanations or instances of coming in from this one consciousness, and then after this body, this experience, perishes, and you kind of fold back into this one consciousness, which some could describe maybe as the mind of God, or the existent, being back into that, or maybe going into what some describe, the afterlife, and So this is where it gets interesting, right? Because now you have sort of the scientific part of it trying to figure out like this baseline constituent of existence, and then you have this spiritual aspect, which is very difficult to kind of touch with any scientific method. If we are all one, what have you found in terms of science, experiments that are happening right now? Any revelations that are pointing to that, yes, indeed, we might be part of like this oneness, this one consciousness? Is there anything that's happening in science that's getting us closer to that?
Yeah, there are a few things. I'll mention two. There is a surprisingly consistent pattern in neuroscience where you see that when some instances of impairment of ordinary brain function, reduction of brain activity, impairment of brain function, not every instance, but some particular instances of impairment of a normal brain function, which you would expect would always lead to a reduction of consciousness, to a reduced richness in the contents of experience, because if experience is brain activity, if you have less brain activity, then you should have less experience under a physicalist paradigm. What you see is a consistent pattern showing that in some instances, precisely the opposite happens. When you impair normal brain functioning, normal brain activity, you get an enrichment of the contents of consciousness. You experience more, you identify with things beyond the boundary of your body, which people call, it's statistically called the feeling of self-transcendence, which people can score according to a standard form, that subjects answer it. It's all very nicely standardized, but the point I want to make is that many instances of brain function impairment and reduction lead to higher scores of self-transcendence and to an enrichment of consciousness, which indicates that normal brain function is just the appearance, the image of a localization or a local dissociation of the contents of a broader consciousness. So when you impair normal brain function, what you are actually doing is you're reducing that dissociation, that localization. You're making the dissociative boundary more porous, more permeable, and you end up experiencing things that are beyond yourself, and therefore the enrichment of experience. I can name some examples of that. We know that some instances of brain injury lead to self-transcendence. We know that even the progression of dementia can do that. We know that psychedelics reduce brain activity, but lead to an unfathomable enrichment of inner experience. Even trivial things like the choking game that teenagers play worldwide. Teenagers have figured out that if they almost choke themselves to the point of almost passing out, they have a transcendent experience that is a lot of fun. It is amazing. They go to other dimensions. So they figured that out, which is terribly dangerous, because then they may make a mistake and actually die. Yeah, and some actually die. So not recommended. Right. A psychedelic is safer. But you have this, which leads to that conclusion that maybe we are all localizations of a broader field of experiences. And the other avenue has to do with physics.
That is so fascinating, and since you brought up all these alternative methods of kind of maybe suppressing or expanding mind in a sense of through different means, whether it's alcohol or maybe even meditation, some people say that can get you there. Definitely psychedelics. A lot of people who are doing that, they express the feeling of oneness with everything, which kind of would fold into what you just said, which is basically the localization of the feeling of that oneness, the self, maybe the ego part, is kind of dissolving as these chemicals are running through the brain, and it basically expands. In fact, that was I'm not sure if that was in your book or if it was another book that I was recently reading, where a person who experienced a stroke explained and described how freeing that experience was, in a sense of not being kind of just stuck in a body form. They literally felt like more outside of that. So very interesting. So I guess our sickness in a way could be called our brain function.
Well, we shouldn't not take it with a too broad stroke, because some kinds of brain damage, they just impair our cognitive abilities. They don't impact the dissociative boundary, so you remain as dissociated as before, just dumber with a less rich inner life. So this is not a call for people to do crazy things.
Right.
But
yes, you heard it. I think you heard it here. Don't choke yourself out, or don't cause any bodily harm to yourself or others. Absolutely not. I guess the point was that in some instances when very specific things happen to your brain that do suppress maybe that function of the brain that makes you feel that you and the extent of your body is basically you and nothing else, then you kind of feel outside of it, which is what people describe. The out of body experiences when people are operated on, sometimes or near death experiences, things like that.
There you go. Yeah.
What other things in terms of if all of the reality, I think you said this in your book, if all of reality consists essentially of one universal consciousness, what are the proof scientific findings have you found to kind of support that idea?
It's difficult to speak in terms of proof, because even science doesn't quite work that way. Maybe mathematics does, but natural sciences, we talk in terms of evidence and what the evidence indicates. Physics, the field of foundations of physics today, foundations of physics is the most fundamental layer of the physical world. It's the study of that most fundamental layer, not the derivative phenomena. Like solid state physics, but the underlying layer, what is at the root of physical behavior. And there are experiments happening worldwide for the past 4 decades or so, arguably since before 1981, when Alain Aspect carried out his defining experiments. And what these experiments seem to show is that what is out there beyond us, the standalone world in which we live, within which we are immersed, doesn't seem to be physical in the way we interpret the world, the word. It is not constituted by physical entities with defined properties like size, shape, position, speed, direction. None of this seems to exist in the world as it is in itself, prior to being observed. It seems to be that it is the act of observation that brings these physical quantities into existence. What is really out there, it's hard to use the word physical for it, because that doesn't have anything to do with what our intuition of physicality tells us. It would be a forced usage of that term. It seems to be a field of overlapping possibilities, like when you have ambiguous thoughts, like you have to decide whether you're going to take a job offer or not, or move to another state or not, but you haven't decided yet, so you live with both options at the same time in your head, and they don't seem to contradict one another, although they are contradictory. What seems to be out there when nobody's looking seems to be of that nature, the nature of an ambiguous universal thought that isn't even local, because that's what the experiments tell us. It isn't physical in the traditional way we interpret the word, and it isn't local either, which indicates a non-local thought pattern. In other words, a universal mind.
So it feels like we're kind of starting to dive into quantum physics and mechanics over here right now, since you kind of mentioned some of those terms that make me think about that. Things like the uncertainty principle, or the quantum entanglement, where you have particles which are one particle, or like say photons split into two, and then they are somehow connected, and then if you observe one, the other one reacts, and it can be at billions of miles apart. We don't know what's connecting them. Then we have the quantum situations where electrons pop into existence and disappear, and all these kind of weird and bizarre types of things is where we kind of are in terms of like science. We took things apart, we sliced them, smaller and smaller and smaller. Electron telescope. Now we're looking at atoms. Then through these colliders smashing particles together. Now we smash them, and then we see even smaller things inside of them, quarks, and that behave in all sorts of different and weird ways. So supposedly responsible responsible for forces in our nature. And then even then, we see more and more of those different particles, and it seems like science is the more it's slicing things smaller, where does it end? Are we just seeing one manifestation of something that was vibrating? There's the string theory, which kind of talks about that everything is sort of like this energy that's just vibrations, and depending on when you capture looking at it, when you observe it, it manifests it in this particle or that particle and things like that. So it's very kind of nebulous in terms of trying to pin it down. But if it is just manifestation of this kind of energy at the smallest level, if it's all energy, and are we manifesting reality? Are we collectively manifesting reality? Does this consciousness that you spoke of that permeates all of our space and existence is what's responsible for actual existence? Is it? Are we in the mind of God?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by we. I am not a relativist. I think there is a world out there that is independent of my personal mind, your personal mind, my cat's individual mind. There is something out there that unfolds in and of itself. Even if we were not here to look at it, it would still be unfolding. It just presents itself to us when we look at it in the form that we call physicality. But when we are not looking at it, it is not physical. It is still something. It is still out there. It's just not physical. It's mental. Maybe we can make sense, because you opened up so many avenues that we can explore. Maybe we can take a historical timeline to make sense of this. Since when science began, arguably science had a false start back with the Greek atomists, Democritus, and all the others. And then there was some dark ages in between, and then we picked it up again in the 17th century with Galileo and later on Newton and so on. So we had this paradigm that things are constituted of little particles, little indivisible bodies, that when they come together, they form the objects that we see around. And then came quantum mechanics around. And the quantum mechanics said, yeah, these little things, they are not even atoms. They are smaller than the atoms, and they constitute the atoms. And by the way, they only exist in quantized states. They are not continuous. They don't move smoothly across space like a billiard ball would do. They either exist here or here or here, and never in between. That was quantum physics. And then came quantum field theory, or in the beginning it was quantum electrodynamics, which then was expanded to generalized to quantum field theory. And what they ended up concluding was that there aren't particles actually. There are only fields that have no spatial boundaries. These are universal fields. And what we call particles are little patterns of excitations of the field. So to give you an analogy, to make sense of this, a particle is to the field like a ripple is to the lake. You can point at the ripple and you can say, there is a ripple. You can measure its position. You can measure its speed, its direction of movement. You can measure its height. You can measure its breadth. So you can attach all kinds of physical quantities to the ripple. But there is nothing to the ripple but the lake. The ripple is a pattern of behavior of the lake in movement. So in the same way, that's how we interpret particles today under quantum field theory. We talk of particles as a metaphor because it's easy, but actually it's ripples on universal quantum fields. And when we say the particle has a certain mass, it's like saying that the ripple has a certain height. There's nothing to the particle but the field. So there are only fields, but multiple fields.
What about... Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish it. So I'll jump in. Go ahead.
And then there are attempts to unify the fields. And that's what you see in string theory, superstring theory, other grand unification theories, or M theory, which is a grand unification of the superstring theories. And there are all kinds of highly speculative things out there that are not empirically grounded. Although it is very tempting to think of the fields as actually different manifestations of only one thing. I would go as far as to say that this unified field is consciousness. That's what we are looking at. We are looking at the ultimate subject, not a object. And that's why experiments with quantum entanglement seem to be so counterintuitive, because we keep on trying to understand those experiments in terms of the manipulation of a object. Even if it's not a particle, even if it's a field, and now we know it's a field, it should still be a field that exists outside subjectivity. But if you would interpret that as subjectivity itself, transpersonal subjectivity, not your subjectivity alone, not my subjectivity alone, but subjectivity out there, a universal thought pattern, then all the difficulties would dissolve. We are getting there. The first experiments have defeated the idea. This was back in the early 80s. They have defeated the idea that what is out there can be both real, in the sense of existing in a standalone sense physically, and local, in the sense that only local interactions produce effects, in the sense that whatever happens in the galaxy of Andromeda right now cannot affect me right now. We know that these two assumptions cannot happen together. You have to give up one of them. And then for 20 years, all the way into the turn of the century, we sort of verified that, eliminating more and more loopholes and confirming that conclusion. And then in 2003, a very smart physicist called Tony Leggett published a paper on a very famous journal called Foundations of Physics, where he showed that some experiments actually differentiated between these two assumptions. Because most physicists would say, well, I'm ready to give up locality. I'm ready to say that there are non-local aspects to the universe, but I don't give up realism. There should be something physically real out there, even if it's a field. And Tony Leggett proposed an experimental way to see if that was possible. Is there something non-local but physically real out there? And the result was, except for a very small class of theories that are very, very unlikely to be true for completely unrelated reasons, it cannot be the case that what is out there is a non-local but physically real field. We seem to have experimentally defeated the notion of physical realism. So what is really out there isn't even physical. It's not local and it's not physical. Again, it's a universal thought pattern in my interpretation. And we are still coming to terms with that, repeating those experiments, eliminating more and more loopholes, because physicists just cannot accept that this is what nature is telling us. They think there was a mistake made somewhere in these experiments, so they redo it again. It's getting more and more expensive to repeat these experiments, but they all the time produce the same results. At some point, we will just have to surrender and say, guys, come on, now it's beyond reason. It's way beyond reasonable doubt already, but it will get to a point where you're wasting public funds to again demonstrate something we know to be true. And we are very close to that right now.
So I have two questions. So does that mean that with the sort of like maybe even like non-locality, and again, I'm not an expert on this, so just bear with my ignorance over here. Does that mean that there's if everything is this manifestation in this field, that everything is connected in the sense that, you know, a blade of grass and a galaxy far, far away still are somehow connected? That's question one. And two, thank you. My quick answer. And two, what about those kind of, I'm not sure if they're edge cases or like these maybe contradictions where you have like a dualism, where something behaves which looks like a particle, but then also behaves as like a wave, kind of like light, right? You have that dualism where you do some experiments, you shoot a laser beam, reflects. Okay, it looks like a particle, but then you have the double slit or slit experiment where you see the interference. So now it behaves like a wave. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, this has been popularized so much. It's very difficult to undo this in the popular culture now, that this is actually not true. And some physicists still insist on this. It's a very naive way of interpreting the experiment. The wave in question is not a physical wave in the sense that light is an electromagnetic vibration in a field. The wave in question is an epistemic tool. In other words, it's a way to encode what we know about nature at a given moment in time. so we can make an educated guess about what nature will do next. That wave is a way to model our knowledge of what might happen next. In other words, it's a wave of probabilities. It's not a wave that is out there. The particle will not suddenly become an actual physical wave. It will behave like a wave because of this, the statistical aspect that is inherent in quantum mechanics. If multiple particles go through a slit, because of the interference between their probability waves, their distribution on a sensor film at the other end will look like an interference pattern that you would expect from a wave. But it doesn't mean that the particles were physically waves. These are waves of probability. These are knowledge tools, models in mind, if you know what I mean. Now, the behavior is such that it is exactly like it would have been if the particles were actually waves. And that's why we talk about this wave-particle duality. But the thing gets overinterpreted, that there isn't that dichotomy, actually. Quantum mechanics is neatly interpretable without the seeming contradiction. The contradiction isn't there. There are other contradictions that arise if one insists on physical realism, insists that there is something physically real when nobody's looking at it, and then contradictions arise. There are some contradictions that arise if we insist on Aristotelian logic, the law of excluded middle, some things that we take as common sense logic. They also sometimes get contradicted. It's hard to reconcile them with quantum mechanics. But the particle wave duality, I think we've made good sense of that by now.
In here, I thought I understood something, but then again, I don't have two PhDs to pull this all apart. The thing that's kind of stuck in my mind is, we're as humans, as these units that are trying to understand this grand universe and this existence that we are in, we might be just not properly outfitted with tools to be able to do that in terms of, there might be there's more than we can possibly even think, because we in our own very nature, we already are looking through a lens. We already are limited to perceptions that we have, our senses. So even considering that alone, we already are handicapped in a sense of not being able to experience or even kind of maybe even talk about what reality is, so that's kind of like something that I always keep in mind, because we're trying to be like all these theories that are trying to unify to explain everything, like the theory of everything, the big toe, and it's just trying to it's like a fish trying to understand a black hole. It's what are we even talking about over here? There's a too big of a gap. So that's kind of what I remind myself of.
It would be a spectacular cosmic coincidence if a few monkeys that evolved on planet Earth, on an ordinary galaxy, on an unremarkable corner of the universe, would have evolved the cognitive apparatus to grant them access to the ultimate truths of the nature of existence. So, of course, we can't do that. What is really going on is, in all likelihood, way beyond our ability to cognize. However, there are certain things that we seem to understand because we make models of them and nature seems to behave exactly according to what those models predict. So there are certain things that we cannot be completely wrong about, because we make good predictions. If we couldn't make good predictions, we wouldn't have developed technology, because technology is applied science. It's using the models of science in order to construct things that behave in a predictable way, like your phones, like this computer we're using right now. So the problem is that some of those models that we know have to be right to at least some extent because they work, they also contradict one another. So they can't both be trivially and completely right, although we know that they are right to a very large extent. And that's what leads to the drive to come up with a theory of everything, which is a bad name for saying that we want to find a way to reconcile things that we know have to be more or less true. but they contradict one another. So it's not really a theory of everything. It's just that science has gotten very good at promoting itself. And it promotes itself with these big words like theories of everything and the God particle and whatnot. We are just trying to reconcile the limited parts of our knowledge that we know have to be true in some way. We need to reconcile them with one another, because they cannot both be true trivially at all times at the same time. They contradict one another. That's what the effort is about.
Even science needs marketing. So science comes up with things that make people think that they understand everything, and so it's marketable then, because people are like, oh yeah, I'd like to learn how everything works. So why not theory of everything? But I get your point absolutely, that there are certain things that we are very certain of, and technology is a great example. It's repeatable. It always works the way we, almost always works the way we think, because I'm sure there's always some kind of weird quantum stuff, and maybe that's why our computers crash once in a while. Some kind of a quantum situation is happening there. But tell me more about, I'd love to learn about in terms of, let's get back into the science of things, and some of your experiences at the European Organization for Nuclear Research at CERN. What are some of the things that you've worked on that kind of put you on this journey that you're on right now? Because you wrote these 8 books which are talking about like this kind of convergence of what we think is real, and then the philosophy, or maybe even spirituality, if you want to call it that, of the manifestation of everything through this consciousness. What are some of the things that you've done at CERN that kind of helped you out with solidifying some of your own opinions?
If I may, I just want to make a quick comment on what you said in the beginning of the question. And the technology seems to work most of the times, but sometimes things go strangely wrong. Maybe there is something we don't understand there. Technology is built, I've worked on technology for almost 25 years now. Technology is built to eliminate the unknown. So we build things in such a way, technically we say that the signal to noise ratio has to be large enough. In other words, the things that we don't understand, we have no idea why they are happening, they are squeezed into a corner in such a way that they can't influence the end result. So the fact that technology works doesn't mean that we figured out everything. No, it's just that we build technology in such a way as to isolate the unknown and render it benign, so to say.
I love that. Okay, so I'm going to jump on that, and then I'm going to let you answer, because you just nailed it really brilliantly. I love it, because it is the probability of stuff, right? Of that, the way current behaves in circuits. It's at some point, even if there is a certain quantum effects that are happening with even the flow of electrons, right? And if they're like even a little bit out of whack, it's still below that noise level that the circuit is going to still operate. Like, it's going to still consider this is a 0, this is a 1 in this digital circuit, right? So even if that noise kind of bumps a little bit higher and it's some kind of quantum stuff that's happening, it's still our circuits are, below this level, that's still 0, and over here all the way up is 1. Thank you for that. I really didn't think of it that way in terms of how we kind of build these things to discriminate against, but underneath still things still kind of fluctuate.
We don't need to understand what we don't understand, so long as we insulate it properly from the rest, so it has no effect on the way things work. It's getting more and more difficult to do that, by the way. The technology game today, we are shrinking things so much in semiconductors that the length of a gate, gate is a crucial part of an electronic switch, that thing that computes. It's either 0 or 1, on or off, and on the basis of gazillions of that, we compute everything. So the length of that gate is getting so small that you can't avoid what we call quantum tunneling. And now we got to the point where we are talking about 20 electrons maybe within that gate, and they're all tunneling. In other words, they are behaving in completely unpredictable ways that we have no clue how to predict.
Right.
And that may make it impossible to isolate the noise, to insulate the unknown. It's one of the big challenges today, is to continue to play this game of isolating the unknown so it doesn't produce any unexpected result and things work reliably. It's getting more and more difficult to isolate the unknown.
Yeah, that's what I've heard in terms of like shrinking electronics into these
tiny circuits where literally we're at such small nanoscales that there's literally these quantum effects happening where, like, electron just pops up on in the wrong lane, and then just if you are not capable of discriminating at that level, then it's just going to mess up your whole logic, and the whole thing just breaks down. Fascinating. Tell me more about CERN, your experience with CERN, and anything that you kind of discovered that put you on this journey or substantiate some of your discoveries on this journey that you're on.
CERN was my very first job. I defended my thesis on a Friday. On a Sunday, I was on a plane, and on Monday, I began at CERN. I worked in the Atlas collaboration team. The LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, this big accelerator that back in 2015, I think, or 2012 was the first announcement when they discovered the Higgs boson. It has 4 experiments, 4 detectors. 2 of them are large ones, arguably the important ones, Atlas and CMS. And I worked in the Atlas team. And what we had to do was to build these enormous detectors around the collision point of the 2 beams. So when they would collide, they would produce all kinds of detritus that corresponded then to the state of the universe a fraction of a second after the Big Bang. And we needed to detect all these detritus in order to reconstruct what happened. The problem is you can't just record everything that you detect, because 99.9 something percent is known physics. And it would take centuries for physicists to evaluate all that and find out what's new. And at the time, we didn't even have the technology to physically store all the data produced. We had to get rid of it before even storing. So we had to identify what was old physics in order to store only what could be potential new physics. Now, there were many ways of trying to do that. I worked precisely in that, in coming up with the algorithms and the computers that would make this decision. Should I keep this event or should I throw it away? Is this potentially new physics? Could this be the boson particle, or is it stuff that I already know, like electrons, jets, and all the rest? Right. So I worked on that, and we ended up adopting a classical algorithm to make that choice. But for a while, there were teams working on artificial intelligence algorithms to make that choice. Today, we would have chosen artificial intelligence because we have today fast enough computers to apply an artificial intelligence algorithm. Back at the time, it was very doubtful, very iffy whether we could have the technology, but I did work on AI algorithms to make that decision. And then AI became a personal activity outside CERN as well, because once you get into that, start thinking about that. How does intelligence work? How should a computer operate to make an intelligent decision here on the flip of a dime in 25 nanoseconds, which was the time we had to make a decision? I mean, it's a peasant amount of time. Yeah. You can't even imagine it. And then once you start thinking about that, how do I make an artificially intelligent computer? You start rubbing off on the next question, which is, what would make this intelligent computer conscious? What would trigger this intelligent computer to have experience accompany its computations in the same way that the operation of my brain is accompanied by experience?
Right. So how does that fit? How does that fit into your broader picture of the consciousness that we started off with this podcast? I mean, do you believe that AI at some point is going to become conscious in a sense? And in what sense? If it does, in what sense would it become conscious?
It's very difficult to answer this question with a single word, so bear with me. I figured that my starting assumptions were completely wrong, because I was assuming in an unexamined way that consciousness is something that you produce by arranging matter in a certain way. And I think that's completely flawed. Consciousness is that within which things are produced. It is not produced because it's what is in there to begin with. So anything else can be produced out of it. So I figured I was thinking about it in a completely wrong way, and that's why I was always facing a wall. Anything I could conceive about how to organize the computer would only lead to more complex computation. I would have no reason to think that that computation would produce experience. And then there was a paper by David Chalmers, a famous philosopher alive today, in which he talked about the hard problem of consciousness. And basically what he said is, it was a recognition. He recognized that there is nothing about physicality in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience. There is nothing about mass, geometric formations, electric charge, speed, nothing about any of these physical quantities that could allow us to deduce what it is like to see red, to feel sweetness, to fall in love, to have a belly ache. There seems to be a completely arbitrary bridge between these two domains, physical quantities and experiential qualities. And once I grokked that, once I realized, yes, this is it. The bridge is arbitrary. So we shouldn't be trying to bridge this. We've made some assumptions here that were wrong from the beginning and led us off down completely hopeless avenues of thought. And that's why we face a wall, because we are following up on wrong conclusions without even knowing. So what I think today is that consciousness is there from the beginning. When we ask, can a computer be conscious? What we are in fact asking is, can a computer be conscious in the same way that you and I are? In other words, can it have its own private conscious inner life? That is the question we are asking. I think that what nature is showing us is that what private conscious inner life looks like from a third person perspective is what we call biology, metabolism. When you have a dissociated aspect of universal consciousness, in other words, private conscious inner life, the way that dissociated complex of experiences looks like from the outside is a living organism, is biology, it's metabolism, mitosis, protein folding, all that good stuff that we only see in biology, and which unifies our life despite the absurd differences between different living organisms. I mean, I'm completely unlike an amoeba swimming in my toilet, but the amoeba and I have something in common that nothing else in nature has in common with us, which is metabolism. Which are the processes of life. So I think what nature is telling us is that private conscious inner life looks like what we call life. Therefore, insofar as a computer doesn't operate on the basis of metabolism, it doesn't have private conscious inner life. A computer is in consciousness, but it is not conscious. And that's a very important distinction to make. For me, everything is in consciousness. Mm-hmm. Everything only exists by virtue of being an excitation of consciousness. But that doesn't mean that everything is conscious in the way you and I are. In other words, in the way of having a separate, private, localized inner flow of experiences.
By the way, I just wanted to give you credit for the use of word grok. So I assume that you are Robert Heinlein's fan, or at least read some of his work.
It's a word that the English language needed. We were in a bad need of having that word, and he came up with it, so why not use it?
I love it. That's huge in my book. Robert Heinlein, one of my favorite sci-fi authors, unbelievable stuff, and coined this term grok, which is in Poor Ben's explanation is to understand it so completely that you know it, you feel it. I mean, I can't even do it. I'm not sure if you can actually even describe it sufficiently enough. But grokking is like this ultimate sort of like knowledge and understanding of something. So
it's knowledge by acquaintance as opposed to conceptual knowledge. You know it by acquaintance with it as opposed to just conceptualizing it, pointing at it through.
Right. When you grok something, it's like you feel it so much that it feels like you just know it inside out. I don't know. I'll pop in some words around that. So everything is swimming in this field of consciousness, which we describe as this kind of axiomatic, this irreducible element, and because of that, everything can exist. The consciousness in terms of artificial intelligence is kind of hamstrung, like you said, because we want to put it in a box of like what we think consciousness is from our own human perspective and experience. And even if a computer like artificial intelligence becomes so complex that may have some kind of remnants of what we think of consciousness, it will definitely be different because it doesn't have the biological processes that kind of drives a lot of it. So it may be some kind of form of consciousness that's similar to ours, but still definitely different.
I would say it couldn't even have private inner life, because I think what private inner life looks like from the outside is a living organism, and a computer is not a living organism. So it is in universal consciousness, but I don't think it has a consciousness of its own, in the same way that a single neuron in your brain doesn't have a consciousness of its own. There's nothing it's like to be a single neuron in your brain. There's only something it is like to be you as a whole. In the same way, I would say that there is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole, but nothing it's like to be a AI. In the same way that there's nothing it's like to be a single neuron in your head. There is only something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. And then the AI is a part of it. It's a part of that image. It's a few pixels of that image of conscious inner life. But there's nothing something it is like to be it other than what it's like to be the inanimate universe as one.
Very interesting. I guess history will tell. maybe we'll build something that's going to be constructed to give us the perception of that consciousness the way we want it. So maybe by design it's going to be more of here's a computer that's behaving like as if it's conscious, but essentially may not be conscious as you and I are in this biological sense.
I have no doubt we can build AI. We can build AI that maybe from the outside is indistinguishable from human behavior. I don't doubt we can achieve that, but I don't think it would be artificial consciousness or even artificial dissociation of consciousness. I even think that we may one day be able to create life from non-life, which nobody has achieved today. Craig Venter went as far as replacing the DNA of a cell with programmed DNA that he synthesized, but he still used a living cell as a host of that synthesized DNA. So nobody has...
So I definitely want to ask you about that, because that's a very interesting question in itself about life. We know the components of life. We can kind of analytically decompose things and tell you exactly what things, you're made out of this many pounds of carbon, this many pounds of this and that, and so on. And a couple grams of some rare elements, I'm sure. And but we don't know. And even if we tried to kind of replicate what we think evolutionarily happened, where it's like this soup of chemicals, and then you add lightning and pressure and these conditions, and it becomes like some kind of a biological or more complex, maybe amino acids, more complex, not particles, molecules, but still no life. So, like, what is that spark of life that's needed in order to make it what we consider alive, which is, I don't know, in a sense, self-replicating, evolving type of biology. So, what is your opinion on what life is when someone, like, are we going to be able to build life from like these elements?
I think life, biology, is what dissociation in universal consciousness looks like. It's the way it presents itself to us. From the outside, it looks like metabolism, what we call life. And the question is, can we artificially induce dissociation in universal consciousness to produce private, dissociated inner life, as opposed to the universal inner life of universal consciousness? I don't see any fundamental reason why that shouldn't be possible. I think at some point, there is a very good theory that is more or less recent, came out of the University of California at Santa Cruz. I think it is the most promising theory right now. It's because the greatest difficulty to explain life is that you need a lot of complexity before something can reproduce and self-replicate, and until it can replicate itself, if it builds all that complexity but stop a hair thin level short of achieving the complexity necessary, it will eventually dissolve, and you will lose all that progress, and you start from zero again. And that's what makes it so difficult. You have to build such a mind-boggling complexity by mere chance before the thing can sustain itself and then evolve and build up on complexity slowly. And this group at the University of California at Santa Cruz came up with this theory based on a society of pre-life, membrane-bound structures that share the burden of building that complexity. So if some of them get knocked off before they get there, the progress is not completely lost because the other members of that little society will carry on. So it's a very good theory. I think it's the only plausible theory I know of. I think everything else is terribly implausible, ridiculously implausible almost. These guys are on the horizon of plausibility, very difficult still, but are on the horizon. And I think if we manage to do that, we will have found an artificial way to trigger dissociation in universal consciousness. That's basically what I think will be happening. I do not see any fundamental reason why we shouldn't be able to be that. And the day we do that, we will have created artificial private consciousness. But it will happen in the form of a living organism that was artificially created out of non-living materials, not in the form of a very, very, very complex silicon computer whose operations have absolutely nothing to do with metabolism. Because what nature is telling us is that what a private inner life looks like is metabolism, not silicon computers. I think we will be able to build AI that is more intelligent than us. Intelligence is a measurable property. It doesn't need to have anything to do with consciousness at all. It has to do with how you process data and behave within your environment. I think I see nothing fundamentally against the possibility that we will build AI more intelligent than we are. Perhaps even go down that singularity avenue, which I think is a bit of nonsense, but I don't discard that completely. But to build artificial, private, conscious inner life is the same as to create life from non-life. It has nothing to do with AI, it has to do with abiogenesis. How do you create a living organism from non-living materials?
But that begs a question. Is life only biology related? Can there be something that's not biological and yet alive?
In the sense of having private inner experiences, it could. It could. There is nothing etched in stone in nature, as far as I can see, that would categorically forbid that. I think the more interesting question is, do we have reasons to think that this is the case? Could it be the case? Yes, but there are so many things that could be the case. I could start listening today and not finish the list until the end of my life, working on it 24 hours a day. Many, many, many things could be true, could be the case, could be out there. But it's not. This is not interesting. What is interesting is, what do we have reasons to believe in? I think we have extremely good reasons to believe that life correlates with private conscious inner life, even a bacteria. And even physicalists agree with that. You know, there's this guy who is always trying to take a shot at me, Jerry Coyne, this famous biologist. He's a militant physicalist, but he doesn't understand the first thing about physicalism. He doesn't know what physicalism is. So he was trying to criticize me, but in his criticism, he says, I think bacteria have experiences, which of course contradicts physicalism. Under physicalism, you need a nervous system to give rise to consciousness. A bacteria has no nervous system. So if you say a bacteria is conscious, you're basically subscribing to either panpsychism or, to my view, idealism. But he was clueless. He doesn't know that. But you see, even a physicalist who doesn't know exactly what physicalism is has the intuition that all life correlates with private inner experience, even the militant ones. And I think that intuition is correct. And the question is, do we then have any reason to think that structures that are unlike life altogether would also be an image of private inner experience? I don't see right now very good reasons to think that, although I am open to the possibility.
One of the things that in your kind of exploration through your books is so we talked about the hard problem of consciousness, right? And then it's paired up with paradoxes in quantum physics and quantum mechanics. What are some of those paradoxes that you found in your research and your experiences that are either hard to reconcile, or maybe you found a way of reconciling them? What are some of those paradoxes?
I alluded to the main one. The main one is that experiments are telling us that what is out there that exists in a standalone way, independent of whether we are around to look at it or not, this thing out there can't be described as physical, in the sense that it cannot be described by any physical quantity. It has no defined state. That's what experiment is telling us. What's the paradox then? Well, the paradox is we assume that everything that exists is physical. So if what's out there cannot be physical, then what the hell is that? You get into a circularity. If you look at what I think is the most promising interpretation of quantum mechanics today, which is called relational quantum mechanics interpretation, it basically says that all physicality is relative. All physical quantities, mass, extent, speed, charge, momentum, all of that exists in relation to something else. It doesn't have standalone existence. It doesn't exist in and of itself. It only exists in relation to something else, like movement. Movement only exists in relation to something else. The contradiction is that what are then these things that exist in relation to... put it in another way. When you talk about movement, movement is relational, fine, but there are absolutes that define these relationships. There are two bodies that move in relation to one another, but these bodies are not movement. They exist, or we assume they exist in an absolute sense, and therefore the relativity of movement has meaning. But when you say that everything that's physical is relative, it immediately raises the question, relative to what?
Right.
Because if everything that exists is physical, and everything that's physical is relative, then you see the contradiction. Relative to what? Right. It has to be relative to something that isn't physical, and which then gives meaning to the physical as a relational aspect of reality, not an absolute one.
So is that the conscious element that's everything is relative to?
Yes. I think what the experiments are telling us is that there is something out there, independent of my personal consciousness, your personal consciousness, but that something out there is not describable with the tools of physics. It is for lack of a better word, it's a thought. More accurately, I would say it's a mental state. It's an experiential state that we can't even fathom because it has probably very little to do with our experiential states. But it is mental. It is experiential. That's what is out there. And what physics models is how those absolute mental states present themselves relative to us, to our observation. And that's why physics is relational, because it's the presentation of a non-physical absolute in relation to us as observers.
So now let's wrap all of this together in relation to your book, Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics. So define to those who, and myself as well, what do you mean by metaphysics, and how does that fold into everything that we talked to right now, which is, we talked about the consciousness aspect, maybe the spirituality aspect of it all, the physical aspects, quantum physics, physicality of what we perceive as reality. How does Schopenhauer's metaphysics fold into all of that?
So first, metaphysics, right? In the popular culture, metaphysics is associated with something spiritual or religious, something metaphysical. It has nothing to do with the technical meaning of the word. Metaphysics is metaphysics. In other words, that which precedes and underlies physics. Physics is how nature presents itself to us, how nature behaves. It's what we can register on the screen of perception with or without the aid of instruments like microscopes, telescopes, measurement instruments. But ultimately, it's what presents itself to us on the screen of perception, because even the readings of instrumentation are only accessible to us insofar as we perceive it. Right. So that's physics. It's what's on the screen of perception. It's the behavior of nature as it presents itself to us. Metaphysics is what underlies that behavior. It's what nature is, the essence of nature in and of itself. That's the field of metaphysics, which has to be informed by physics, because any metaphysics that contradicts physics is just plain wrong. But physics is not sufficient to pin down what nature is. It's only sufficient to pin down how nature behaves as far as it presents itself to us. What nature is, in and of itself, is something we can only guess at. We cannot prove, although even physics we can't really prove. But anyway, but there are methods to make educated guesses about what nature essentially is. In other words, the correct metaphysics of the universe. Methods that allow us to distinguish between hopeless metaphysics and promising metaphysics, and therefore make an informed choice about how to understand the essence of nature. So this is what metaphysics is. Should I segue now into Schopenhauer?
I was going to ask you, and so how did that fall into Schopenhauer?
Okay. Schopenhauer, over 200 years ago, he published his great metaphysical tome in 1818. 2-volume. Well, back then it was a 1-volume book. It grew to 2 volumes in the second edition a few years later. It's called The World as Will and Representation. And there Schopenhauer introduced his metaphysics with the language and concepts of his time. And that's why it feels very inaccessible to us today. It's very difficult for us today with the conceptual infrastructure we built today to understand what Schopenhauer meant, because he used the words and the concepts and the lines of thinking of his time. But he was essentially saying what I'm saying 200 years before me, and there were people saying that 3,000 years before him. But anyway, we go only back to Schopenhauer. That the world is mental in essence. In his words, the world is will, and the will is only one. There is only one will, and the will is the inner essence of things. Why did he choose this word will? No, the will, it has to do with volition, right? With what I desire, with what I fear, because fear is also volition. It's the inverse of the desire. Desire is what you want, fear is what you reject. This is all will. So what he meant by the word is experiential states that are endogenous. In other words, that don't depend on perception. Even if you were in an ideal sensory deprivation chamber, unable to see anything, hear anything, smell anything, taste anything, or touch anything, you would still feel desires and fears because they are endogenous. These are experiential states that arise within you and not from the world out there. So for Schopenhauer, the world out there, as it is in itself, is constituted of these endogenous experiential states, like desires and fears. Another reason for the word will is that Schopenhauer realized, like any reasonable person would, that the universe is dynamic. Stuff is happening. Rain falls, the sun rises, the moon goes around the earth goes around the sun is spinning away around the center of the galaxy, and the galaxy is moving around. I mean, stuff is happening all the time. So if the essence of the universe is will, that will has to entail a impetus for action, a impetus for change. If the universe didn't want to go anywhere, it wouldn't be going anywhere, right? It would be static. Nothing would be happening. So, but stuff is happening. So for Schopenhauer, this is why stuff is happening. Because although the universe presents itself to us as physicality, in his words, representation, the universe as it is in itself, it is will. It is a set of volitional experiential states. And that's why the universe is moving. That's why things are happening, because there is a volitional impetus behind the behavior of the universe. It is trying something. Schopenhauer also said the will is blind, which was his word for instinctual. The will is not deliberate. To deliberate, you require what Schopenhauer called re-representation. You and I would call it self-reflection. Deliberation, our ability to turn our thoughts into objects of our thoughts, our ability to ask questions like, am I thinking about it in the right way? This requires metacognition and the ability to cognize your own cognitive states. For Schopenhauer, the will out there that underlies the inanimate universe is not capable of this metacognition. It is instinctual. It behaves like a crocodile would, based on instinctual volitional states.
Do you think it was just his opinion that that's the case, or was he basing that on some kind of I don't know, maybe not an experiment, but like why do you think he thought that?
He justifies this. He justifies that by saying nature's behavior is predictable. Mm-hmm. If you look at predictable animal behavior, you get to instinctive animals. Crocodiles behave in a very predictable way. Fish behave in predictable ways. Higher animals don't behave in predictable ways. Their behavior is orchestrated by much more complex mental states. Arguably, some higher animals have the ability to metacognize. Elephants, superior primates, cetaceans like dolphins and whales, and surely us. And so we have more complex behavior based on social cues, a complexity of inner states. But nature is highly predictable. Physics has proven this. The existence of technology shows that nature behaves in very predictable ways. And that's a clue for us to guess it from the inside, from the side of will as opposed to representation. Nature is instinctive, because instinct is predictable. Another thing he always talked about, he was one of the first philosophers to bite the bullet of the horror show that nature is. A lot of people before him, like Hegel and the absolute, and the universe is trying to understand itself, and we see that reflected in history, and this world is the best of all possible worlds. People always try to rationalize things to get reassurance that this is not just crazy, this is all for a good reason, and there is a higher plan behind all that. And Schopenhauer came around and said, no plan. It's a mess, because there is no plan, because nobody's metacognizing anything. Nobody's thinking about what's happening the way that we think about our plans. It's just instinctive. And that's why it's a horror show. That's why animals eat other animals alive. I mean, I was watching this documentary the other day. An elephant who was, with medium-sized elephant, not grown up yet, and a pride of lions managed to bring the elephant down. And they started eating the elephant from the hind legs, the butt and the upper hind legs. But the elephant was alive for 6 hours, with the lions eating him alive for 6 hours. I mean, the horror of that. I mean, the horror in your backyard, ants cutting up earthworms in pieces. I mean, it's a horror show. I mean, it's an incredibly beautiful show from one hand, on the one hand, and it's a horror show on the other. So upon recognizing this and biting that bullet, Schopenhauer's conclusion was no thinking, intelligence has nothing to do with it. No premeditating consciousness or will, his terminology, would put itself through this, because at the end of the day, it's the will putting itself through it. It's the will suffering the consequences of what it's doing. So he figured no metacognizing intellect or awareness or will would do this to itself. So conclusion, the will is instinctive. It's doing it to itself because it doesn't know any better. It's trying to figure itself out.
Very interesting. My perspective on that is that complete awareness, that consciousness potentially wants to experience everything, even as horrifying as an elephant being eaten alive, because it wants to maybe experience everything that there is, being a worm and being an ant and being everything else, so that all possibilities could be experienced, even those from our perspective being as either atrocious or terrifying or painful or what have you, because it's almost like we are in a world of dualities, of light and darkness and pain and pleasure and all these different things that define, and one does not exist without the other one. So my perspective on it is that perhaps even though Schopenhauer thought that logically doesn't make sense. Why would this thing want to be, experiencing all these different bad things? But necessarily, if you don't have pain, then how would you know what pleasure is? If you're not sad, how would you know you're happy?
I am presenting Schopenhauer, so this is not necessarily. Well, it's largely the way I think as well. I have sympathy for what you just said. I have some intuitions that there must be something to what you just said. But I have difficulty articulating this in a way that I could defend. Because when I look at the objective evidence, I go with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was perhaps, well, at least in the West, he was the first naturalist idealist. An idealist is somebody who thinks that it's all mind out there, not only my mind or your mind, but it's all mind out there. But a naturalist idealist would be one that says, and this mind out there behaves instinctively just like nature seems to behave. It doesn't have a plan. And the idealists before Schopenhauer tended to attribute a plan to that mind out there. Hegel allegedly did it. Bishop Berkeley did it explicitly. He thought that God had a plan behind all this. So Schopenhauer was the first one who endorsed idealism, but at the same time he said, but I'm also a naturalist. I don't think that there is a higher plan, a premeditated higher plan behind what's going on. It's just nature unfolding the way it does because nature is what it is. And that, I think, is something that we should recognize him for. He was the first in the West, the first naturalist idealist, and I think he deserves credit for that, even if ultimately it turns out that he was not completely wrong. It turns out that he missed some important things. Even if he did miss, the fact that he opened up this avenue, naturalist idealism, I think it's deserving of credit, and it's very important.
Perhaps there is a room for a hybrid in this. One of the things that makes me always think is Alan Watts, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or some of his work. But some
of his work, yeah.
Yeah, he brought something up that made me, and it makes me think a lot in terms of, consider this. If this consciousness is ever present and everywhere, whether it's God to you or just this total awareness or superintelligence and it can manifest everything what we consider reality, manifest physicalities the way we presented, which is what we talked about, then at some point it would want to experience or would want to build everything possible, because it would quickly become bored, in a sense of, like, can you imagine if you would be this omnipotent thing, and it could create anything, anywhere, and all of that, and then quickly you become all possibilities can happen, and then it becomes bored. So then he said that maybe it started to do incorporating an element of uncertainty, and maybe it wanted to, just like a dream, something happens in a dream, but it's still a dream, and you wake up and you're still fine. But even that becomes boring after a while, because it's a dream. It's kind of like a lucid dream. You can kind of control things in it. So maybe the next level is like, well, what if I would make myself forget that I am this creation that I created? And this kind of goes into the Upanishads, the philosophy from India or philosophy, or like the wisdom from the Upanishads, which one of the quotes that I'm going to butcher it right now, but then he realized that he is the creation, for it came forth from within. Right? So it created that creation that was out there. And then those who realize that become, in this creation, creators. So then you have that kind of, everything is connected back in. Like, you are the manifestation of this maybe total consciousness, but it wanted to forget what it is, because then there's like sort of no skin in the game. If I am this omnipotent thing that can do anything and manifest anything and do everything, it becomes boring. But if I make myself forget that, then, that's interesting now, because now I can experience all these things, and I have my life online, and, ego kind of develops in that, maybe that space. And now the game goes on. So maybe there is a space for having this consciousness being sort of in control of everything, in a sense of allowing for things to manifest the way it wants to, but also have this instinctual part of it, which is like, I don't know that I am that which I created, and in which case the game is very interesting.
Alan Watts' delivery is just is phenomenal, right? I mean, it's very difficult not to go along with him. I'm very sympathetic to this. I think there is a tremendous risk of anthropomorphization here, because we are projecting onto universal consciousness some experiential states that are eminently human, basically, namely boredom. It's a projection. Do we have any reason to think that a universal mind would experience something along the lines of boredom, which is a mental state that has evolved in us because of our response to the environment? We evolved within a planetary ecosystem, and then we developed this response to the environment, and boredom was a trigger for you to take action and increase your chances of survival. Would that be applicable to universal consciousness? So if I think about it objectively and I leave my intuition aside, then I would say there's a high risk of anthropomorphization behind this thought. But I will go along with you there, and I'll mention something that is relevant to the hypothesis you raised. The hypothesis you raised was that the mind that did it is metacognitive. It can do things in a premeditated, thought-through manner. But in a premeditated way, it has surrendered its ability to premeditate in order to be fully engulfed by the game. And then you use the metaphor of the dream. I would dream now and I will forget that I'm dreaming. So the dream is not lucid anymore. Now, scientifically, we've known since 2006 or 7 that the main difference between a dream and a waking state, or between a dream and a lucid dream, is that in an ordinary dream, we largely lack metacognition. Mm-hmm. We become incapable to think the thought, should this be happening? What am I doing here? What should I be doing next? Where did I just come from? Why do I find myself here? I mean, these are all thoughts that arise from your ability to metacognize your own experiential states. Otherwise, you're instinctive and you just flow along with the dream in a very uncritical way, which is what actually happens in most ordinary dreams. We don't ask the questions like, where did I come from? Why is this happening? Otherwise, we would figure out immediately the absurdity of the dream, because the dream has no logical continuity. Things happen in a sort of illogical, arbitrary way. But because we are not thinking metacognitively, we don't figure that out. We just go along with it in a rather instinctive way. We feel things, we experience things, but in a non-critical or non-self-reflective or non-metacognitive way. So that would reconcile Watt's view with Schopenhauer's view. The mind at large, or universal consciousness, is fundamentally metacognitive, but it has surrendered its ability to metacognize by dreaming and forgetting that it's dreaming, and therefore, during the experiment, it is not metacognitive, except for us as elements of it. It could be. I find this very seductive. But if I put my objective mindset in place and I really analyze very objectively, in a very hard-nosed way, do I have good reasons to lend credibility to this as opposed to the fully naturalist hypothesis? I would feel obliged against my own feelings and intuitions to say, no, we do not have good reason to think that. It's not parsimonious. It's more complexity than we need to explain observations.
You're just crushing my world over here, man. Stop it.
But I share your affinity.
Well, it is very seductive, and in my experience, it's something that's appealing to me because it does make certain amount of sense. Maybe it's because I have some derivative thoughts based on some science fiction that I watched. There was this character Q on Star Trek, which is this omnipotent being, and I think it's kind of going along the way with what they were like. If you were this omnipotent thing that could manifest everything that we consider reality, then at some point you would really become bored. Unless there's some other parallel universes in which you can do something else. But in this kind of space that we're in, if you could manifest everything and live through everything and experience everything, then at some point, you would become suicidal, because what would be the point of this existence, that you experience everything, being a quark and being a galaxy and all of that. Therefore, it kind of follows in my brain that this consciousness would want to create what we just talked about, like this kind of element of surprise, element of the unknown, element of the game, and still be both. So I'm going to stick with that.
Look at it from the perspective of meaning. Which of the scenarios would lend more meaning to human life? I think Schopenhauer's scenario lends a lot of meaning to human life, because basically what he's saying is that we are the leading edge, man. Universal consciousness only achieves metacognition, only raises its head above the currents of instinctive experiences, the overwhelming flood of instinct. It only raises its head above that through us. We are the end product of this whole thing. And all this suffering has been an incredibly high price to pay. And what we got out of it, what universal consciousness got of it, was our ability to look at it and ponder it and to ask, wow, what is going on?
Right.
What is this? Where are we going? Where have we come from? And this is the payoff. This is the lottery win, and it's us. And it's happening through us. I mean, the value of human life, even if your life is suffering from beginning to end, even if you accomplish nothing in your life according to the values of our culture today, you are cashing out for universal consciousness through your suffering, through your inability to achieve anything, because your ability to metaconsciously, metacognitively be aware of this suffering, be aware of your inability to achieve anything, to get anywhere, that is the payoff for universal consciousness. Compared to the state of universal consciousness before that, all that suffering, all that fruitlessness, apparent fruitlessness, was the payoff, was the lottery win. Meaning becomes overwhelming for any living creature. The mosquito squash on your forehead later tonight has had a meaningful life in the sense, or insofar as it has participated in the play of the ecosystem that has given rise to us and a few other conscious beings capable of metacognition, capable of asking the big questions, which universal consciousness, under Schopenhauer's hypothesis, was not able to ask, because the will is blind, the will is instinctive. It's causing suffering because it's like a half-drunken person waking up, and it's clumsy, it falls off the bed, it hurts itself because it's not thinking straight. And we are the parts that are finally able to contemplate this and say, oh, okay, this is what's happening. We are the payoff, man. Tremendous meaning.
Well, I think if that's the case, I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, and surely it would go unless we will kill ourselves, which has happened, or which it got close to many times. So hopefully we will not extinguish ourselves, this light in this existence. What do you think is happening, in context of everything that we talked about? What do you think is happening when we do cease to exist in terms of our, human life, in terms of like this biological form and function? Do you think, what do you think is happening? Anything? Are we just go back into the fold, and none of it is going to be reverberating, so to speak, in that ultimate consciousness? What do you think is happening?
It definitely reverberates. I think life is the image of a dissociative process in universal consciousness. People with a multiple personality disorder, as it used to be called, you have multiple alter personalities, and they don't have the same memories. They don't even sometimes know of each other's existence.
Right.
That psychiatric condition is now proven through neuroimaging. It actually happens. People are not lying. They are not making stuff up. For the past 10 years, we have known this. I think something of that kind is happening at universal consciousness, and we are the dissociated personalities of universal consciousness. We are the alters, so to say. And life is what dissociation looks like. It's the image, the appearance of dissociation. Therefore, the end of life is the end of the dissociation. It's the reintegration of the alter personality into the host. Somebody with dissociative identity disorder, which is the modern name for multiple personality disorder, can also be cured. That person can be cured. And then the memories and the character traits of the alters are reintegrated into the host personality. And the host now knows that it was several, that the host was several. And the host now remembers the memories of each of the alters and the points of view of each of the alters. And I think something like that happens. When we die, our dissociative process ends, because death is what the end of the dissociation looks like. It doesn't cause it. It's what it looks like from a perspective. And our mental contents are reintegrated into a broader context, which could be an intermediary context of differentiation, or it could be straight back to universal consciousness. A way to think about that everybody can relate to is the following. When you're dreaming at night, an ordinary dream, you are dissociated because you think of yourself, your dream avatar thinks of itself as separate from the mind that creates the rest of the dream. So if I am a dream avatar and I'm walking in a building, my dream avatar thinks of itself as separate from the mind that is conjuring up the building, that's making the building exist. So we become dissociated within ourselves, because you know what? It's us imagining the building too. It's us imagining the whole thing, even the other characters in the dream. But during the dream, the avatar, our avatar, is dissociated from it and doesn't identify itself with the rest. When we wake up, we realize that it was us doing the whole thing. We were conjuring up the whole thing, the right. Dream environment, the alter. But we don't mourn the death of the dream avatar.
Right.
Now, we don't wake up and say, oh my God, he died. No, we just realize it was me all along.
Right.
And you still remember the experiential contents of the dream avatar. You remember, you have the memories of the dream avatar.
Right.
You realize
if you're lucky to remember your dreams.
If you're well, I'm assuming that you can remember your dreams. So the dreams that you can remember operate that way. You don't mourn the death of your dream avatar. You don't mourn the end of the dissociation. And nothing is lost because you still remember what happened. You just realize that all along you have been more than that dream avatar. You just forgot who you really were. You got dissociated from parts of yourself, the parts of yourself that were making up the rest of the dream. But there is no reason for mourning. Yes, the dream avatar ceases to exist as a differentiated agency or an agent. It no longer exists as an agent. It only exists as a memory. So it dies, all right? It's toast. When you wake up, your dream avatar is toast. It is gone. But nobody mourns it because you just remember who you really were all along. And the memories are preserved. They are just now spread into a broader context. I would say something very analogous to that is what happens when we die.
So do you think that's a clue, maybe, that this ultimate consciousness is giving us through like this process of us dreaming, that something like that, a parallel, could be happening to it as well? That this consciousness is dreaming all of this up and living, all these dreams in parallel everywhere, like through everything that we think of as creation. And then when it wakes up, we cease to exist?
I think this is a direct implication of both Schopenhauer's and my metaphysics. The question is, the universal mind, is it dreaming it instinctively, or is it dreaming it in a premeditated way? That's the only question.
That's the only question. That is the big question. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you distilled out of all of this, like the takeaways? If you were to mentor someone and tell them, here's my life's work. You wrote 8 books thus far. You'll probably write another 8 or 18 or 88. I don't know. But thus far, if you would distill this knowledge to someone, and when a child would ask you and say, what is the meaning of life? Am I really alive? Is there God? All of these things, based on everything that you've researched so far, both in the sciences and with philosophy, what would you say?
I would say, just like for every generation before us, all the way to the beginning of Western history, our mainstream view about the nature of reality is wrong. We have no more reason to think that we are any more right than the generations before us. Every mainstream view about the nature of reality has been wrong, and so are we. At some point in the future, people will look back in horror at what we put ourselves through by having this materialist take on the nature of reality. People would say, these people were crazy. Couldn't they see that that was obviously wrong? What were they thinking? That will happen. Well, watch and see what that unfolding. That would be one thing. The other thing I would say is, you as an individual agent will most definitely cease to exist. That's death. Is there anything to be worried about? Not anymore than you have reason to be worried about the end of your dream avatar when you wake up. You have no more reason to be worried about the end of your dissociated individual agency as to be worried about the end of your avatar when you wake up from a dream. So relax.
Don't worry about it.
Suffering is probably not coming to an end. That's the fairy tale of materialism, right? Whatever happens, it will come to an end. Suffering will stop. Well, maybe not. And there's potential for suffering going on as well. So too bad. However, all that suffering is pregnant with inevitable and overwhelming meaning. Whatever you do, whatever happens to you, whatever happens, it's pregnant with unfathomable meaning. All that suffering that may never end, it is pregnant with meaning. And as Carl Jung used to say, meaning is the most important thing. There was another psychotherapist, what was his name? He wrote a book about it. He was a Jew, and he was incarcerated in a concentration camp during World War II, and he did therapy groups with the other. Viktor Frankl, yeah. He championed this idea that meaning takes precedence over pleasure. The pleasure principle of Freud, or the power principle of Nietzsche. Viktor Frankl, together with Jung, came up and said, no, it's about meaning. Meaning is the most important. And that's what he told his friends and colleagues in the concentration camp who were going through indescribable levels of suffering. And that's how they kept alive, by reminding themselves that, yes, it's horrible, but there is a meaning to this. And if you have meaning, you can go through anything. I think that would be the final thing I would emphasize to everybody. The focus we have now on being happy is a catch-22. We are securing a terrible life for ourselves, because happiness is a transitory state. Make no mistake, for Bill Gates, happiness is a transitory state. You can count on it. It's not about money. It's not even about health. There are people who are in terrible health, and they have extremely meaningful lives. It's about meaning, all right. That's what we have to get in our heads. It is not about the absence of suffering. It's not about being happy all the time. It's about, is there meaning? And the day we realize this is the day our lives will be a lot better.
Happiness is not a destination, right? It's not this thing that we achieve at some point, and there you go. I've climbed on this pinnacle of experience. It's called happiness, and here I am, and I will always experience it. It'll go down as quickly as it goes up, and I think that's one of the pieces to kind of keep in mind as well.
And happiness is something that can be taken from you, and the world can take happiness away from you, but nobody, not even the Nazi prison guards, can take meaning away from you. Nobody, nothing, no force in nature can take it away from you the moment you see it and hold it. But you have to see it.
But you have to see it.
Sorry.
You have to really, and you have to remember about it too, because that too, the meaning of life is something that you may have one day, and the other day you might lose it. I mean, it's like, unless it's so clear to you, so ingrained in you, then you will pursue that, and that is going to be truly the thing. But sometimes meanings of our life are kind of hijacked by our society, which is telling you what is it that you're supposed to be doing and or feeling, or what happiness or success means in your life.
But that's the thing, and that's why I would go back to Schopenhauer. We have many narratives of meaning. And many of those narratives are just fairy tales, or they are just there to dupe you, to cheat you into conforming to a system that's beneficial to others and not to you. I'm not talking about the narratives of meaning, the meaning we make. Psychology is filled with this idea of meaning making, as if meaning were an insubstantial thing that we just conjured up out of thin air. What Schopenhauer was there to tell us is that meaning is not something that you make. Meaning is something that is there, whether you see it or not, whether you recognize it or not, whether you have a narrative about it or not. It's inherent. It's inherent in nature. It's inherent in the will. The will is trying to figure itself out. And it does that through us, despite the horror show that life is. So, again, I'm not talking about a narrative of meaning. I'm talking about
I see what you mean now.
The meaning that is immanent in everything. And if you see that immanent meaning, it's not fragile. It's not something that you can wish out of existence. It's very robust. It's not something that people can take away from you. It's not a story that you can retell and change. It's immanent. It's just shining through everything. It's there. If you see that one, that's the one nobody can take from you.
Thank you for that, because I think I just looked at it from a different scale. I was thinking about an individual meaning instead of like this overarching meaning of everythingness, of that consciousness that you mentioned as the irreducible element of everything. It's just there. So I was looking at it on a different scale, the wrong scale.
And that's why we need to recover Schopenhauer, our Western inheritance here that we are neglecting.
What is next for you in terms of you've written 8 books, you've explored all these different topics, and you're building a sort of a legacy of understanding how all these pieces fit together. What is next for you in your life's journey?
I've actually written 10 books, 2 of which are in the production process, and they will come out. They're in the making. They're in production already, so they will come out in 2021 and 2022. The next one is called Decoding Jung's Metaphysics. So yeah, there are these 2 books. I have very recently taken a major step in my personal life. I have worked as a technology strategist in the high-tech industry for a number of years. That's how I have earned my living for well over 2 decades.
Right.
I have taken the step now to leave that and dedicate myself fully to philosophy. We are starting a new foundation now, Essential Foundation. It's not public yet because there's a lot of background work you need to do before you can show something to anybody. But we have the very modest objective of making metaphysical idealism, this idea that all reality is mental, into the mainstream narrative of our culture. A very modest objective to be achieved in our lifetimes. That's the ambition. It's backed by some big guns. We have the means, we have the resources. So I don't think it's impossible. It's just a very, very difficult task. So that's what lies ahead for me. And other than that, man, I've knocked my head against walls so many times before that I've gotten to a point in my life now that I go with the flow. I don't really, it's an illusion to say that I choose to do what I'm doing. The choice is made somewhere in my unconscious mind. I'm just witnessing the choice that has already been made. The only freedom I have is to accept and go with the flow, or to resist it, but not to choose. And the choice that is made for me is that this is what my life is all about. It has been already for 10 years, and that's what my life will be for the foreseeable future, until another choice is made for me. And then I have the freedom to go along with that too. But for now, it's about changing our mainstream metaphysics into a more plausible one, which is idealism.
What do you think it's? How do you know when the path that's ahead of you is the right one? Is it through feeling that you have about it?
Oh yeah, when you are not following your path, everything becomes very difficult. It's like the whole world bumps against you. So you know it when you realize it's going smoothly or more or less smoothly, because sometimes it's very difficult to pursue the path you chose in the sense of achieving success. So I don't mean that. I don't mean that the right path is the one in which you achieve successes. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is that psychologically, for you, it's the path of least resistance. Whether you achieve success, whether you are successful or not, it's the thing that comes most natural to you. It's the thing you do before you think about what you need to do. For me, a major characteristic of that is the level of focus I have when I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I can be in a very bad health state, I can be stressed, but I can still have complete focus on writing an essay. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's the telltale sign that this is where I have to go. And when you're not doing that, everything becomes a symptom. Mm-hmm. Your body aches, your body reacts in all kinds of funny ways. It's difficult to wake up and jump out of bed in the morning. Everything becomes boring. Everything becomes difficult. I'm not talking about achieving successes. I'm talking about how smooth it is to engage in the activities, whether ultimately it's successful or not. So I can fail completely in turning our mainstream culture into idealism, but it feels very natural to try to do that every day. And the day doesn't feel natural anymore. It's the day I know, well, another choice has been made for me, and then I am free to go along with it or resist it.
That's great how it can give you a reassurance of, in a almost like a tranquil way of knowing that when it's right, it feels right. And you just kind of flow along with it instead of resisting, against the current.
Whether you succeed or not is utterly unimportant in this context. What feels right is not that in which you succeed. God knows it's much easier to succeed on other things than what I'm trying to do right now. So that's not it. It's not how successful you are. It's about how natural it is to engage in that attempt. At least for me.
Bernardo, thank you so much for this. I mean, you've shone a light of different perspective on multiple topics. Thank you for excellent examples that kind of shifted some of my thinking, some of the perspectives, and things that I haven't even considered. I will definitely add them onto my tool belt of understanding in my experience.
I'm glad to hear that.
I'd love to have a conversation again with you, and I'm looking forward into digging into some of your other books, because there's just so much to read, and I would love to do this again with you and maybe deconstruct and talk about some other aspects that you covered in your other books, because there's a lot of fascinating topics and questions that I wanted to ask forever. So I'm glad that someone like you is really someone so smart is really taking the time to taking things apart and trying to build some kind of narrative around it and a story for people to kind of look into and enjoy. Here's your 30 seconds for kind of giving a shout out to anyone and everyone, or maybe summarizing your thoughts on everything that we talked about to kind of end this episode on.
I would just point everybody to my website. You can find everything else from there: videos, essays, papers, books, everything. It's Bernardo Kastrup, one word, .com, Kastrup with a K, K-A-S-T-R-U-P.
Mm-hmm. And we have that on the screen right now, so that for those of you who are watching, you can also reference that. And we're going to put that in the show notes. And Bernardo, again, thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. It's been mind-boggling and opening and reassuring and conflicting. And I'm going to watch this episode myself to kind of deconstruct all the stuff that we talked about. So thank you again for being in the show. And until next time, I'm going to prep by reading some of your other books, and would like to revisit some of your other books that you published.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I will be glad to come back.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you to you, listeners, for being on the show. If you survived it all the way to the end over here right now, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation with Bernardo and gotten something out of it. And let us know what that was. Put some comments in feedback and let us know what you enjoyed about this. What else would you like to listen to when I talk to different guests on the show? Reach out to us. Apodcast.com is our website with all the links to the social media. Follow us, and hopefully you'll share this with others who you think could benefit from this. And until next time, I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is The Adrian Sinclair Show.
Thanks for listening to a podcast with interesting people. Please subscribe and leave a review or comment.
And support us by sharing our episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. And for more information, visit us at apodcast.com. Thanks.